Hey Kansas City, welcome to episode 14 of the Made in KC podcast. Today is day 14 of Kansas City's stay-at-home order. I'm Tyler Enders.
I'm Keith Bradley.
And I'm Thomas McIntyre.
Today, we have the privilege of checking in with Mayor Quinton Lucas to ask him about our city's response to the coronavirus pandemic. We'll be asking him about his early decisive action to implement a stay-at-home order, and we'll also be asking him for his thoughts on what the recovery will look like. Hey, Mayor Lucas. Good morning.
Hey, how are you doing? It is great to talk to you. It feels like we were all just celebrating the Super Bowl, and thank you for that great package of stuff. I'm wearing it all the time now because I'm usually home now, so I get to wear T-shirts, all that stuff.
Well, thanks so much thanks so much for taking time to talk with us today. We know you're very, very busy.
Happy to be with you.
Well, we like to start out by hearing how everyone's personal lives have changed in the past 14 days. So, can we start there?
Yeah, life has changed tremendously. I feel like it was just yesterday that I was planning to go to the Big 12 basketball tournament. Just a different time in our country. And what I've been impressed by is how quickly Kansas City and Kansas Cityans have adapted to what is at least our new normal for a little while. I personally am used to having a lot of events in the evening and in the mornings, and now it is all dried up. But, we have different challenges, a lot more interaction virtually, a lot more social media for better and worse. But, it's a time that I'm trying to stay in touch with my friends, a lot of the people who keep me going, but certainly I miss a lot of that interaction with our community.
So I've got to imagine that the life of a mayor is very, very busy, and that during extraordinary times such as these, that goes to a whole new level. How are you managing and digesting your flow of information, and how are you getting your news?
First of all, I've got an outstanding staff that's with me. Most people are working from home now. I still got a skeleton crew here at City Hall, and I think we're trying to make sure we cover and do a lot of the work of the city each day. So that's one. But, for me, I have always been a little bit of a nerd, and now some of those tendencies help me out. I read a ton. I try to stay up to date with our communications, both with the state of Missouri, state of Kansas, our other regional jurisdictions around us. And it's a lot of that talking, coordination. But, another thing I do is that I do make sure either I or somebody on my staff is watching every one of the governor's press conferences, both in Missouri and Kansas. We tend to follow what is coming from the CDC, what the president has to say. Usually you get a morsel of something from it. And so, we go through all those steps to make sure we're abreast, not just on what's happening scientifically, but also, politically throughout the country.
And if someone's a little bit behind on local news, if they've been paying attention to the national headlines, but they don't have a great sense of how Kansas City's been handling this, what's your brief overview of how KC's been handling the coronavirus pandemic?
I grew up in the church, and so I'll just say briefly there, but for the grace of God go I. And so I think that we've certainly in Kansas City looked at what's happened in places like New York, in Seattle, Detroit, New Orleans. But we have been very fortunate for a few different reasons. One, I think we were pretty early, given the number of the cases that we had at the time, to have issued an emergency proclamation back on March 12th is when I issued one for Kansas City, Missouri. I remember at the time, there were a number of people who said, well, Lucas, you've canceled every wedding in Kansas City. Mm-hmm. And believe it or not, back then, that was a very controversial move, and had these heartbroken couples that were calling me and that sort of thing. I think it turned out to be the right decision. And we have seen that the efforts taken in Kansas City that now have included closures of schools, include a ban on any events over 10 people, the non-essential business closures have really made some clear steps to save lives. And I'm proud that I think we've done important work to flatten the curve in Kansas City.
Yeah. Well, before I let Keith jump in, I'll just finish by saying we've been super proud of the job that you have done and that the Core 4 has done. And we feel that you guys absolutely made the right choice by taking such early, decisive action.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's vital. I know we've got more work ahead, but I'm just thankful that, we all got together and realized, beyond politics, beyond fears about business, and we'll keep trying to work to make sure they can survive. But that was key for public health.
Mayor Lucas, this is Keith Bradley. Great to talk to you again. At Made in KC, we've been focusing on a couple different initiatives while our stores are closed. One, we've been trying to build community through this podcast. through positive posts on social media. We've also been focusing on making washable, reusable face masks with other local companies. Additionally, we think that the best thing that we can do and other people can do is social distance, work on making or providing money to provide PPE for healthcare workers and others, increasing testing capacity, and also being a good neighbor, helping your community out, whether that's monetarily through positive social interaction. In your opinion, what do you think the greater Kansas City community needs to be focusing on right now, and what should our priorities be?
Two things that I think are going to be incredibly important. One speaks to the idea that we need to make sure we're taking care of, I think, a lot of those organizations that are looking out for different parts of our community. And I mean by that, to the extent that, for those of you who are making PPE, getting them to our homeless shelters, because that is a significant at-risk population, folks who need masks, that sort of thing. That's key. If you're someone who, like me, has absolutely no talent at anything from sewing to, anything else, if you've got a few bucks to give, and it doesn't have to be a lot, $10, $15, $20, getting that to, and some of the organizations that are working hard to provide community health and support right now, I think is important. On the business side, I think it continues to be important for us to actually look out for what we can do to support small businesses. One of those things that I'd said in connection with the wedding coordinators, and I thought it was a great idea, they were saying, people were saying, don't cancel your events, just postpone them. And, to the extent that you had ranging from a bar mitzvah to a wedding to, a retirement party, go ahead and postpone that sort of thing, but keep it going so that when we open back up, we've got, a lot of things that are in the pipeline and are ready to get started. So that's some of it. But, more than anything, do what you can to stay home. Do what you can to limit the number of your trips. I mean, this is a really tough time in our country, and I know it's easier said than done for a lot of people. But, the more you do that, the faster we get out of this.
I've already postponed my retirement party by about 10 years because of this.
I understand. Yeah.
On a more serious note, we recently read that a group of local business leaders have purchased about 50,000 testing kits in the Kansas City metro area. Do you have any updates on what's the latest around Kansas City's testing efforts?
It's not where it needs to be, and I'll both fall on that sword, but then also say that when I get off this call, one of the things I'm doing is calling down to my state capital, Jefferson City. I mean, I think it's unacceptable right now that we still are not at a point where we even know the full impact of community spread in Kansas City. And we need to get there. We need to have better than to tell people, you have to be deathly ill to actually get a test. I think it has allowed for some of the challenges we've had over time. I mean, it's easy for us to throw stones at all those spring breakers who were a little irresponsible, frankly. But at the same time, I don't think we have been clear enough in this country with the very serious challenge in many ways because people didn't understand. We get things that we see. We understand when you are seeing however many deaths or recognizing an illness. But for this sort of thing, where there has been so much spread and so many people who are asymptomatic, it's important for us to get that testing out. So that's work we continue to do with our local hospitals, care providers, our insurance companies, and the state. And we need to get a heck of a lot more in Kansas City.
Yeah, thanks for that honest response. I have one more question for you, and let me reiterate what Tyler said earlier. We do think you've been doing a fantastic job being the face of not only our city, but the core four. So we greatly appreciate that. In general, how do you think Kansas Cityans have responded to the stay-at-home order? If you had to give them a grade, A to F, what would you give us?
You know what? I'd give us a B+. I mean, I know, and I read the paper like everybody else or see the news. I mean, a lot of people like to talk about the exceptions. Guys, I am darn proud of the fact that, and who would have ever thought this, that, 4 weeks ago, this was a bustling city getting ready for spring. And, today, there are a lot of people that said, you know what, this is going to hurt my business. You guys know as well as anybody. I mean, none of us have gone through these steps in saying we want to do this. And all of us have said, but you know what? I'm not going to be shady. I'm not going to try to trick things. I'm not going to try to look through any number of exceptions. I'm going to do the right thing for me, my workforce, my customers, and take a break. And that is really tough when a lot of us, all of us, still have bills coming in. And so, I'm proud of Kansas City. I know it's like anything, it's an adjustment. I mean, we've had to chase teenagers out of parks, and sometimes we have to chase retirees out of parks and that sort of thing. But at the same time, I think most people are responding, and I'm proud of that. And I think Kansas City's only gotten better during the pendency of this order.
That's great. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Thomas.
Good afternoon, Mayor Lucas. First, some personal business, actually. I owe you a thank you. We met once at a First Friday event, and then a few days later at the Plaza Art Fair. And I was with my wife and a group of friends. You said hello, and my cool level went up tenfold after that moment. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Happy to do it.
But yeah, a big part of this podcast that we're doing is looking forward, looking at the future, past the pandemic, what things will look like. And what do you think we will as a community learn from this pandemic? And what do you think the public sentiment regarding healthcare or education or the inequality in pay in those areas will change after this?
A few things that I hope we're ready for. I mean, for several years now, there has been less investment in public health. And by public health, I don't just mean, the hospitals. And we know about fundraisers for name your hospital or that sort of thing. But what we haven't thought about, are the people who are kind of the expert researchers, the folks who are studying epidemiology, the ones who track influenza literally every year, that sort of thing. We need more there. We need more investment there. We need to not get startled by these things every generation. It was, going on 40 years ago that the AIDS virus appears in our country, right? And it took us probably, 4 to 5 years to figure out just what's going on, a decade to figure out the messaging we need, and then, continues to be a challenge in our country and our world. I think, we were kind of caught flat-footed on this one, and knowing how we would respond and knowing where the research is. So I hope people recognize, whether it be the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention or it be your local health department, we have got to invest in all of that, even if it's not, somebody you see every day. I think the other thing that we recognize now is we have to figure out a better way to provide social services. And what I mean by that is this. I continue to have great fear for what the impact of this virus, after others have been treated, will mean to the homeless community. So much of how we provide services to them is communal, right? You have soup kitchens, you have a shelter, you have places where people go, where groups go. What we haven't thought of is, how do we reach individuals? How do we make sure that we continue to trace them? How do we make sure that we're continuing to provide them good services? And so there's a lot of work to do there. And then finally, as always, business. How can we make it, so that we have a better situation in which people can survive, that we've diversified, our tax revenues in a city? That's the sort of stuff that we've got to work on. And, we're learning a lot from it now.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one thing you mentioned is the investment in those areas. And one thing we mentioned in the earlier podcast was hoping that even a long-term goal is that some of the younger individuals out there in school are looking to choose what to study, are potentially inspired by what's happening, and then that there's an education that happens there, and we have more people during times like this because they went through this and were hit by it and struck by it and chose a career path as a result. Earlier you were talking about how one of the things you're doing right now is making sure you don't miss a single address by the governors or speeches by the governors. You or your team is doing that. And in that light, it's been interesting to see the role of mayors and governors in this process has grown incredibly. Do you think that will be the new norm going forward? Do you think it'll subside after this and go back to kind of where it was beforehand? Or they continue to hold a bigger role in our government and rolling out policies and things like that after this pandemic?
I think this gave an opportunity for mayors, governors, the president to show what our jobs are really about. And, it's not just ribbon cuttings. It's not just Chiefs parades, although I'd love to go back to that. It also, really requires us to step up at times like this. Some people have shined, others, have not. And I think it will hopefully tell the public the next time they're making a choice, it isn't about who would you rather have a beer with, although that's cool too. It's also about, who's going to be ready for that moment of crisis. Because I will tell you, from my position, there were tough calls to make on a lot of different occasions. And, my office today was looking at infections in the Kansas City area. And I continue to believe that the reason that we don't have more, that we don't match what you see over in the St. Louis metro, comparable size, and a few others, New Orleans, which is a smaller metro, is because some of the decisive moves that we made. So that's, where I think hopefully people in the future say, not just, do you have a good family or you speak well as a candidate, but also, how will you be able to handle this moment of crisis? And that's something that I'm very interested in making sure that we're well prepared for.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's going to be a bit of a reconciliation for both voters and those wanting to take part in government to realize the depth of what the job is, given the time period that they're doing it, and that could change like we saw in a matter of 24 hours. So, I appreciate that response. And then lastly from me, do you want to speculate at all about what you think the recovery will look like? And do you think there will be a new normal after this, time frames, and both on a Kansas City and global level, if you have any thoughts on it?
I do think there will be a new normal after this. There's something interesting about our country, which is not only its ability to adapt, but also its ability to, oddly enough, get back to some of the same viewpoints, challenges, things of before. I think we'll all remember this. I think we'll all be touched by it in very different ways. But I also think people will remember the way life was before and will look to go back to it. And it may not be instant, but I think that lots of those things will go back. And so, I don't know. I know there are some who think the world will always be changed. But if you look at past epidemics, past wars, past issues, you often see a resiliency in our country and in our city. And I think that you will catch that same situation here. And I look forward to that and look forward to leading during that time as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we are very resilient, and I'm hoping that we're resilient in the positive ways, but that there are some scars that are left that remind us of this time and the importance of taking the right steps as a community that keep us from coming back to this spot. All right, Tyler, I think you have a couple more closing thoughts for us.
Yeah,
right?
Do you have time for one more?
I do, yes.
Okay, so in terms of recovery, there are some things that we're hoping. We hope that most things go back to normal, but we've also seen some really incredible action. We hope that some of those things will stick around. And so, for example, the way that our local municipalities have worked together has been really inspiring. And so we were just discussing some crazy moonshot ideas for the Kansas City area just to try to figure out, how can we take this collaboration a step further. And so you had mentioned the homeless population as being very at risk. And I know that you recently worked on getting some additional care for the homeless population with, I think it was, and you could expand on this more, but getting a motel to help house the homeless.
Absolutely.
In terms of a long-term initiative, do you think there's a role that private business could play or that local hospitals could play? So imagine Truman, KU Med, and others pooling money together for some sort of prevention fund. And so doing some research on a Kansas City level to see how many hospital nights are we spending, what's the cost of these hospitals, what are the things that we can do in terms of mental health, counseling, career coaching, job training, housing assistance. It's not any one thing, but is there some role that collaboration in the private sector and then collaboration between all of our municipalities could play to create some sort of moonshot prevention fund for homeless in Kansas City?
So a few things. First, on regional collaboration, what I think we need to understand is that it needs to be an ongoing conversation. If I had a critique of what regional collaboration looked like before, it was always centered around just one thing. I was able to peeve a bunch of mayors from the Kansas side earlier this year because we were having to talk about the border war truth. And I said, well, where's our conversation long term about, equity and economic development throughout our region? And they said, well, what does that have to do with this temporary thing? And I said, there is no temporary thing. How we work together, how we interact is actually forever important. And I think that's the same way with the way that local leadership, elected leadership, needs to work with businesses. Too often, and it goes both ways. Too often we come to you because we're saying, hey, everybody, we're doing this thing. We want a bunch of spirit. We need money. Be there for us. Or vice versa, business is saying, hey, we're looking to develop this thing, or we need a new airport, and do that. And that's good. Those are important things. But at the same time, we also need to hit that step where we're actually saying, hey, how do we keep this going? How do we make sure that we are ready for the next big challenge? How do we make sure that we actually are investing in some of the things long term? We see right now that at our safety net hospitals, and you identified Truman, KU, right, that there's going to be this huge number of people that need services and families and others that don't have resources. And when you're talking about a virus like this one, a lot of the health work is going to be for people that aren't even hospitalized, right? What do you tell to, somebody who's out in a high-risk job right now but lives with grandma or something? What are they supposed to be doing? We want to be more prepared for that in the future, and I think ongoing conversations are a key part of it.
That's great. I love it. Well, thank you so very much for your time. We know you're crazy busy. Do you have any other things that you want to leave us with, things that you want to remind Kansas Cityans of at this time?
All I'll say to Kansas City is a reminder to stay home. I know we're doing it, and I know that we're doing well. And the other thing is, better days will be ahead, but the only way we get there, and the sooner the way we get there, is if we all just chip in, stay home, stay safe.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your leadership during this time.
Okay, thank you. Look forward to talking to you on the other side. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.